William Faulkner is arguably the greatest Southern writer to ever exist. Born in 1897, his large bibliography won him the Nobel Prize for Literature, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and 2 National Book Awards, among many other accolades. His most famous works, such as The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, and Absalom, Absalom, are mostly set in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, based on Lafayette County, where Faulkner would spend most of his life. Faulkner also wrote poetry, short stories, and was generally a very prolific writer. His books deal with many different themes, but generally center around ideas such as racism, generational trauma, and fatalism, to name a few. His style is famous for its use of stream of consciousness writing, that is, writing that serves as a direct exploration of a character's interior monologue, often ignoring traditional rules of punctuation and sentence structure. Ralph Ellison, writer of The Invisible Man, called him the greatest artist the South has produced, while others have described his writing as impenetrably convoluted. In relation to this, probably my all-time favorite Faulkner quote comes from this common complaint. In a 1956 interview, Faulkner was asked, "Some people say they can't understand your writing even after they read it 2 or 3 times. What approach would you suggest for them?" Faulkner's response: read it 4 times. Personally, I was first introduced to Faulkner in high school when we read As I Lay Dying in my senior year English class. I was immediately hooked by the wide array of perspectives, writing styles, and the unique structure of the book. I went on to read As I Lay Dying again, then The Sound of the Fury, Light in August, and Absalom, Absalom, the last which became one of my all-time favorite books. I love the way Faulkner bends the English language to his will to explore the human condition, experimenting with the way a book, a chapter, or even a sentence can be constructed to get at exactly what he wants to convey. Through reading some of his novels, I felt emotions I've never felt before from literature, whether that be Rosa Coldfield's empty resignation from life, Joe Christmas's doomed wandering, or Addie Bundren's seething hatred for her family. These books are really in a world of their own when it comes to capturing the many sides of what it means to be human. While I've read 4 of his novels, and some multiple times, I had barely dipped my toe into his large collection of short stories, of which he wrote over 100. With that in mind, I decided to make it my mission to get familiar with his shorter writings, and only a little bit of research led me to the subject of today's video, 1950s Collected Stories of William Faulkner. This book of 42 different short stories won the National Book Award in 1951 and was authorized and supervised by Faulkner himself, who came up with the book's section titles. Admittedly, this was a pretty big undertaking, as even though it's only one book, my edition stands at over 900 pages, making this a pretty big read for me. The book is split into 6 themed sections, with those being the country, the village, the wilderness, the wasteland, the middle ground, and beyond. The section titles are pretty self-explanatory. The country deals with the southern countryside and Yoknapatawpha County. The village largely takes place in Jefferson, Mississippi, and is tied for the longest section at 11 stories. The wilderness focuses on a Chickasaw tribe and mainly on a chief by the name of Doom. The wasteland contains stories about World War I. The middle ground is the other largest section and is a kind of catch-all for stories that don't fit under the other 5 categories, while beyond is something of an anomaly for Faulkner, focusing on the supernatural. Despite this collection winning a National Book Award, I actually found it pretty difficult to find more information on a lot, if not most of the stories here, with oftentimes the only discussion online being an offhand mention in a Reddit thread or a 3-sentence Goodreads review. People will talk about the collection as a whole and highlight the big stories, but a lot of these are just not being discussed anywhere. Because of this lack of conversation, I decided I would do my best to revitalize the Faulkner fandom and make a video ranking all 42 of the stories contained within this almost 1,000-page book, with an explanation for each placement. Keep in mind this is only my opinion, and this ranking isn't super concrete, as I've only read a lot of these stories once. Also, I love most of the stories here, so don't take any low placement as a slight. With that in mind, though, I thought it would be a fun exercise and hopefully maybe even inspire some of you to read a few of these stories. So with that, let's start off at the bottom with number 42. Coming in at number 42, our lowest ranked story, I have to put Dr. Martino. Coming from the middle ground and originally published in 1931, then later included in the 1934 collection Dr. Martino and Other Stories, I really dislike this one. I know I said I love most of the stories in this collection, but this is the most glaring exception to that rule. Focusing on the story of a suitor and a young woman obsessed with an older man named Dr. Martino, I found this one both confusing yet predictable, poorly written, and formulaic. It almost seemed like an author attempting to write like Faulkner, and definitely not succeeding. The whole thing felt amateurish, which is crazy considering this was published just after As I Lay Dying was. This was the one story from this collection that really left a bad taste in my mouth, like a serious, what the hell did I just read moment. I'm most shocked about how this is the titular story for that 1934 collection I named earlier. I seriously do not see the value in this story and believe it should have been left on the cutting room floor. These characters are borderline annoying, and the way they interact just drives me up a wall with how cliche it is. Probably the story's most egregious sin is how serious it seems to take itself, which, with the quality of the literature, makes everything almost laughably bad. Ignore. Coming in at number 41, we see a dramatic improvement from Dr. Martino in the short story Centaur and Brass, from The Village, and first published in 1932. This one follows a bit of a convoluted scheme in the town of Jefferson by one Flem Snopes, hungry for brass and ultimately wealth. For my Faulkner fans out there, you may recognize the name Snopes from his Snopes trilogy, those being his 3 books, The Hamlet, The Town, and The Mansion. That aside, though, the story was just too contrived for me to really enjoy it all that much. There weren't any glaring flaws, but it felt like Faulkner had an idea for this crazy scheme and then couldn't figure out how to translate into a story that was actually entertaining. Most of this one is devoted to what feels like a lengthy explanation, almost like a heist movie or something, but without the quirk and ridiculousness that comes with a good heist movie. The ending tries to be a cool twist related to the title, but the whole thing just kind of falls flat. This felt more like an outline of a story than a real story in and of itself, which lands this one so low on our list. Coming in at number 40, we have Low from the Wilderness, first published in 1934. This is the one story from the Wilderness section that is separate from the Doom storyline, following instead a president who is basically Andrew Jackson, as he reckons with a moral dilemma. A nephew of a Chickasaw chief is accused of killing a white man, and this president is forced to oversee a kind of mock trial for the supposed killer. My main gripe with the story is how it starts. As we'll see with a few of these stories, it starts in what seems like an almost purposely confusing way, and then becomes much more clear a few pages later. I obviously like Faulkner quite a bit, so I'm more than used to his sometimes impenetrable writing style, but this one felt almost deceptive in how it portrays things in the first few paragraphs. I also felt like this one lacked a bit in terms of much going on, really. The obvious tension mentioned many times throughout doesn't amount to much of anything, and the conclusion felt pretty anticlimactic. With that said, though, this wasn't a terrible story at all, just one that was short and not sweet enough. Coming in at number 39, we have Victory from the Wasteland, published in 1931. This is our first World War I story on the list, and it's the one that's probably the most typical interpretation of a World War I story. This one follows a World War I veteran, starting near the end of his story, and then taking us through his journey throughout the war, and then the destitution that followed. This one doesn't have many glaring flaws, it just felt a bit cliche, for lack of a better word. The sarcastic title doesn't do it any favors, as I feel the beginning of the story is definitely its strongest part, with the progression just becoming more and more predictable as it goes on. Not to a fault necessarily, I just wasn't particularly shocked when the whole thing came to a close. Still, not a bad story, I just prefer something a little more original from Faulkner. Coming in at number 38, we have Fox Hunt from the Middle Ground, published in 1931. The story has multiple perspectives, making for an interesting structure, but this is probably the strongest thing it has going for it. It generally follows an older man as he attempts to reclaim his youth by engaging in a vicious hunt for a fox. Like I said, the different narrators keep this one interesting, but generally the story is a little lackluster. I didn't feel a strong connection to anyone, and the way the man's desire to stay young is conveyed is a little confusing and roundabout. Not a terrible story, just one I could skip and not miss much. After those few not so great stories, we're finally in the clear of stories I definitely like. Coming in at number 37, we have A Courtship from the Wilderness, published originally in 1948. This story follows two men, the Chickasaw men who would later become Doom, and a white steamboat pilot and fiddler, both competing for a woman's hand in marriage. The story has a good balance of humor, not too in your face, but enough to keep the whole thing lighthearted and entertaining. I like the clear progression and gradual upping of intensity throughout as they compete for her love, and then the way that the story ends caps it off perfectly. Overall, the story was only really brought down by the low stakes and lack of emotional depth, but as a fun read, I think it checked all the boxes. Its unique setting and characters, as for most of the wilderness stories, is also a nice diversion. Coming in at number 36, we have A Bear Hunt from the Country, originally published in 1934. I found this story to be a lot like Centaur and Brass, just funnier and with better execution. Instead of a convoluted scheme for Brass, it involves a practical joke to get rid of some hiccups, and largely does not involve a bear at all, where the hunt serves more as a setting than the focus. Like Centaur and Brass, the story has a good deal of explanation in it, but the payoff, unlike Centaur and Brass, was much more substantial. I also enjoyed the light touches of the supernatural in the flashback about the nearby Native American mound. One of the better funny stories included in this collection, and a nice break from the typical Faulkner gloom. Also, don't confuse the story with The Bear from Faulkner's other short story collection, Go Down Moses, as people online seem to do. These are totally different stories with no connection, so just be aware. Coming at number 35, we have The Leg from Beyond, our first entry from this book's final section, published in 1934. This story follows a World War I soldier who loses his leg in battle and then goes on a strange and surreal quest to recover his lost limb. To be honest, the story was pretty weird, especially the dream sequences, and the structure of the whole thing was also fairly odd. Also, Faulkner was a fan of Melville, so I don't think that the connection between this story's protagonist David and Moby Dick's Ahab are unfounded. I did appreciate the risk the story took, and the structure, like I said, caught me off guard a bit, which I liked. Things are left pretty up to interpretation for the story, but I think it serves it well. Not as good as Moby Dick, but what is? Coming at number 34, we have Crevasse from the Wasteland, originally published in 1931, and one of the shortest stories in the collection. This World War I story follows a troop of soldiers who, while avoiding enemy fire, fall into a deep shell pit and have to dig and crawl their way out. This story, while being very brief, was genuinely haunting in its descriptions of the conditions in the sinkhole, as the soldiers find the rotting remains of several of their comrades within the pit. The story totally could have been part of a larger novel, but as a standalone, I think it works well too, with the imagery carrying most of the weight. The end of the story especially is gripping, with the desperation of the soldiers feeling very visceral as they dig out with their bare hands. A very interesting little vignette, and one I'm glad was included in this collection. Coming at number 33, we have Hare from the Village, published in 1931. This story follows Hackshaw, a barber, and Susan Reed, a little girl who's initially terrified to get her hair cut, who grows up over the course of the story. This one is actually pretty disturbing in its themes, as Hackshaw's infatuation with Susan Reed becomes more and more apparent as the story progresses. I thought it was interesting how Faulkner portrays Hackshaw as this upstanding if a little mysterious character, whose true feelings become more unavoidable as Susan Reed matures. The way Hackshaw's backstory also unravels is well done, as our nosy salesman narrator pokes more and more into his peculiar life. Not a happy story by any means, but Faulkner does a good job of showing how these evil things can be perpetrated by those who may at first appear to be generous and understanding. Coming at number 32, we have All the Dead Pilots from the Wasteland, published in 1931. This story was originally titled Per Ardua, which relates to a story I'll discuss later titled Ad Astra. The connection that these titles come together to form the phrase Per Ardua Ad Astra, through struggles to the stars, also known as the motto for the Royal Air Force. Something that will become more and more apparent as we go on is Faulkner's interest in aviation, a category this story definitely falls into. With that said, this one follows two pilots, Sartoris and Spoomer, as they engage in a bit of a romantic rivalry over a Frenchwoman. This story is one of those that starts innocent enough before eventually devolving into some pretty reprehensible actions. I especially like the role that letters play in this story, as our narrator, a male censor, reads the letters written by the soldiers. The ending also packs a punch, making this a nicely contained little tale. Coming at number 31, we have Artist at Home from The Middle Ground, published in 1933. This story follows a moderately successful writer and his wife as they move from New York to the country and end up hosting a variety of different artists. The one who sticks around the longest, a poet, eventually becomes romantically interested in the writer's wife, causing all sorts of problems and tension. What I like the most about this story is the almost soap opera-like characters. Everything feels very high stakes and dramatic, not in a bad way either. The emotions are just running high as these people get involved in a crazy love triangle. They're weeping endlessly, standing outside in the rain, and writing nonstop for 48 hours as everything is pushed to the extreme. Very entertaining and memorable, with a perfectly tragic ending. Coming at number 30, we have The Brooch from The Middle Ground, published in 1936. This story follows our protagonist Howard as he deals with his domineering mother and new wife as they all share the same small house. This story reminded me a lot of one we'll get to later, titled Ellie, as it centers around the conflict between the old and new Southern culture. The bedbound mother is the driving force, controlling Howard's life to the point where he feels like there's no escape from her until she dies. His wife Amy is also trying to pull him away, but this only leads to more tension and lies. The struggle is captured well by the titular heirloom brooch that the mother gives Amy, an item that becomes central to the climax of the story. My favorite parts of the story were the stray nature of all the relationships, along with the gut punch ending. Poor Howard. Coming in at number 29, we have Shingles for the Lord from the Country, published in 1943, which is actually the second story in the entire collection. This is a nice, cute, and simple story about a struggling farmer as he helps to rebuild a church's roof. I like the narration from the man's son's point of view as he watches his father try to convince his neighbors about how they should divide up the work. I find that most of Faulkner's best stories are written from the perspective of a child, and this one is not an exception, even if the scope of the narrative is pretty narrow. The one thing dragging it down is the haggling between the father and his neighbors as they debate about work hours, as it takes up a good chunk of the story, but it feels like it could be cut down a bit without subtracting much from the payoff at the end. I did appreciate the more lighthearted tone though, and the father's attitude about things is refreshingly optimistic amidst all these pretty down vignettes. Not super grand in scope like I said, but it accomplishes what it set out to do well. Plus the ending is great, as is true for a lot of these. Coming at number 28, we have Mule in the Yard from The Village, published in 1934. This story follows Mrs. Haight, and then another member of the Snopes family, as they fight over a mule and was ultimately a story about revenge in its own unique way. The story has some interesting, almost slapstick moments, as Mrs. Haight chases down the mule in the opening section of the story, something that's pretty unique to it. The story also has a tragic edge to it in relation to Mrs. Haight's late husband, but it's got a nice gotcha-style ending that left me very satisfied. Apparently, the story was also adapted into a chapter of his later book, The Town, so if you want to see it in a greater context, you can find it there. Coming in at number 27, we have There Was a Queen from The Middle Ground, first published in 1933. This story follows the Sartoris family, reduced to the women, as they share a house with several black servants. Particularly, Narcissa Sartoris struggles to maintain the image of the family as she is overseen by Miss Jenny, the 90-year-old chair-bound matriarch. I appreciate how we see the family and Narcissa's story through multiple pairs of eyes, including her own, as she gives basically everything in order to save the Sartoris legacy. The climax of this one is pretty depressing, like a lot of Faulkner climaxes, as we see the desperation and necessity of keeping the family name clean. The way the title plays into the themes of the story is also really well done. A nice female-led story that engaged with some typical Faulkner ideas in a cool way. Coming at number 26, we have Turnabout from the Wasteland, first published in 1932. This story follows an American bomber pilot and a British naval lieutenant as they both go on each other's assignments, those being an airstrike and then a torpedo boat ride. These two missions carry both a lighthearted attitude, yet close to death stakes, as they narrowly miss a fatal end on both of these trips, with the American bomber pilot maintaining a cheery mood throughout, in contrast to the British soldier's dour tone. It's an interesting dichotomy between two ways to view warfare, and putting these characters alongside each other lets us see how they interact, agree, and disagree on certain things. I will say this story starts pretty strangely, as it's written like you already know all the characters involved before you've even begun to read. This made the first few pages quite confusing, but thankfully because it's Faulkner, I would say this odd choice actually works pretty well in the grand scheme of things. This one fits the short story format in a nice way, and doesn't take up any extra pages, if that makes any sense. A fun, if tragic story, whose high-octane action helps it stand out amongst the rest of this section. Coming at number 25, we have Beyond from, Beyond, first published in 1930 as Beyond the Gate, and then later in 1933 in the form we see in this collection. This story centers around a judge wondering about the afterlife, engaging in strange conversations with various people as he searches for his dead son. This is actually one of the more surreal stories included in this final section, as the whole thing feels very dreamlike. Characters and settings appear and disappear as very little is explained to you, at least in any clear way. It's an interesting experiment from Faulkner that stands pretty distant from a lot of his work, and even within this last section there's not much like it. Of course, this one starts a little confusing as well, but as it reveals itself, the story just gets better and better. The central image of his son riding on the pony stands out the most, and the emotional weight here is strong. It's also interesting to see Faulkner explore familiar themes like loss and regret in a completely new setting and playing by different rules. If you want a story from Faulkner that's him outside his comfort zone, then this one is for you. Coming at number 24, we have Pennsylvania Station from the Middle Ground, first published in 1950 with this collection. This story also takes us out of Mississippi, this time to a train station filled with drifters. I really like the way this one initially sets the scene. The description of the station and the people inside is classic Faulkner prose. The story is told via a conversation between two of these drifters, which is a style that Faulkner really excels at. See Absalom, for example. The anonymity and non-specificness of a lot of the details here give the story a timeless quality, like it could be happening anywhere, at any time, or at no time at all. The actual conversation itself is great. It's a methodical retelling that expands out as you read, with details initially peppered in, being recontextualized and redefined as you go. I especially like the detail about the $200 wreath of flowers, as the speaker slowly becomes more and more honest about that fact as he explains what really happened between this web of relationships. The tone of the story is spot on too. There's a matter-of-factness about the whole thing that makes the twists and turns even more grim and real. The way the real-time story at the station is interwoven into the narrative is also really well done, and grounds us in a unique way that elevated the story a lot. Coming at number 23, we have Ellie from The Village, first published in 1934. This story is similar to The Brooch, but instead follows a young girl as she struggles to escape from the controlling judgment of her grandmother, leading her to some pretty extreme actions. This conflict to me represents the division between the old and the new South, as the grandmother upholds traditional values, as the titular Ellie fights for her freedom, mainly in the context of romantic and sexual relationships. The ending of this one definitely is a gut drop, and I like the ambiguous nature of it. Another strength of the story is how much the conflict seems to live within Ellie's head. Not much is actually said between her and her grandmother. It's more this brooding and crescendoing anger that builds and builds until Ellie is practically frenzied. A nice, succinct story that has a clear purpose and great execution. Coming at number 22, we have My Grandmother Millard, also titled My Grandmother Millard and General Bedford Forrest in the Battle of Harrican Creek, comes from the Middle Ground and was published in 1943. This story, narrated by the titular Grandmother Millard's unnamed grandson, follows a Southern family as they plan ahead of the looming Yankee forces that are soon to arrive in Jefferson. I appreciate the family unity in this story. It really felt like the members of the family were looking out for each other's best interests, something you don't see a lot in Faulkner's writing. The star of the show, of course, is grandmother Millard herself. This matriarch directs and leads her family the best she can as they reckon with the incoming Yankee invasion, and is clearly the one keeping everything together. Their need to keep their valuables safe from plundering, to me, is a clear analogy for their need to preserve their southern values and traditions, the fear being that the North will come in and steal and destroy what they've been building for generations. The story was written like a family legend, a story that gets passed down orally from person to person because it embodies what the family is all about, which I thought was a cool tone to strike. We're officially halfway through. Feel free to grab more snacks and replenish your coffee because we have 21 more stories to discuss. Coming in at number 21, we have Divorce in Naples from Beyond, first published in 1931. This story is interesting because it actually follows a relationship between two sailors, both of who happen to be men, something pretty out of the ordinary for Faulkner. It's also nice to see that there's basically no homophobia in the story, and this homosexual couple is treated basically like any other relationship. We follow these two men, George and Carl, as we learn about how they get along in their time on the boat, mainly through extended time spent dancing together. This changes, however, when they land in Naples, and Carl goes offshore to experience what it's like to be with a woman for the first time. This betrayal obviously causes some problems, as our nameless narrator watches the two reckon with what the future of the relationship holds. I enjoyed the exploration of love and sex throughout the story, as what each character values and is afraid of is slowly revealed to us through their actions and inactions. One thing I will note is that it's a bit unclear to me why the story landed in the final Beyond section, as there's nothing even slightly supernatural about this one. No dreams, ghosts, or what have you. Whatever the reason for its placement, though, I really like this one and how it dealt with ideas about what love can look like in a unique way. Coming in at number 20, we have Wash, which opens up the middle ground, published in 1934. This story is interesting, and it's basically an addendum to Absalom, specifically focusing on the unraveling of the character Wash Jones as he slowly realizes the reality of his relationship with Colonel Sutpin. This one was written in a similar style to Absalom, and as that is one of my favorite books ever, you can say that I really enjoyed the writing here. The story is a great example of what Faulkner does best, exploring the degradation of a relationship through the eyes of a character who both knows and doesn't know what's going on. Someone who may be aware but doesn't want to be. My one gripe with the story is that, being that I've already read Absalom, this one is kind of unnecessary. That's no fault with the short story itself, it's just that it doesn't bring up any really new revelations about the original text. Like I've said, I love how it's written, especially the way it climaxes, but I think with just Absalom, you can get a grasp of what's going on inside Wash's head. It's not a bad story at all, and it's actually a really good one, but it's something really only a true Absalom fanatic that's hungry for more would enjoy. Coming in at number 19, we have Dry September from The Village, published in 1931. This story is about a black man accused of attacking a white woman and the public outcry and lynch mob that follows. What really happened is of course left ambiguous as we, like the characters in the story, grasp at fragments to piece together the reality of what, if anything, actually transpired between the watchman Will and Miss Minnie Cooper. I liked how the backdrop of the hot and rainless September adds to the tension and anger within the townspeople, a clear indication that outside factors are, at least in some part, driving the violence in this town. This tension makes the end of the story all the more haunting as we get the perspective of Miss Minnie Cooper, with her mental breakdown left up in the air to its real cause. The story also proceeds to Kill a Mockingbird by about 30 years, so it's interesting to see how similar they are. Coming in at number 18, we have Honor from the Middle Ground, published in 1930. This story follows a World War I aviator turned wing walker in a circus as he begins an affair with his pilot's wife. This story, like Artists at Home, explores infidelity in a pretty theatrical way, with characters almost acting like caricatures as the story spirals towards its inevitable conclusion. The initial confrontation between the two men over the affair is almost surreal in its matter-of-factness, but the confusingly calm attitude of the pilot becomes more and more understandable as his goals get revealed. I especially enjoyed how the wing walker ends up in a nightmare of his own creation, with his fear tangible as he scrambles to escape from his own undoing. I also think the framing of our main character being a World War I veteran is interesting, and it creates a cool juxtaposition between the ideas of honor in a relationship and honor on the battlefield. Overall, the story just made me feel worse and worse as it went on, in the best way, of course. Coming in at number 17, we have Death Drag from The Village, first published in 1932. This story has us follow a group of Depression-era stuntmen as they perform a death drag, a dangerous aerial stunt involving a plane and a car. If it hasn't become abundantly clear by now, Faulkner really likes planes. This story is great for the tension between the performers. There's a lot of animosity in the group, and the way this anger translates into an even more ridiculous stunt is pretty insane. I also liked how the story shows us the background for the kind of people willing to perform a crazy act like this, and how their own suffering and desperation has led them to this kind of profession. The three men in the group all have great descriptions and characterizations, both through their actions and also what they all say about each other. The way the story builds up to the eventual death drag is great too. You, the reader, like the townspeople watching, are filled with a strange mix of excitement and dread as the time draws closer. And what a conclusion it is. Coming in at number 16, we have The Tall Men from the Country, first published in 1941. This story follows two police officers, one local sheriff and one draft investigator from out of town, as they go to confront a family for their two sons' draft evasion as World War II looms. The real narrative comes from the dialogue rather than any actions, as the local sheriff slowly explains to the other officer about why these young men are choosing not to fight. I really explored the exploration throughout the story of themes like duty and pride. What seems to at first be a simple situation, it's slowly pulled apart by years and generations of belief, passed down from father to son, that applies to everything from farming to war. The way this story ends is great, as the two officers perform their own active duty, which I won't spoil, that is equal parts grim and satisfying, as the draft investigator finally begins to accept what's really going on here. Again, the story doesn't have as many twists and turns like a typical Faulkner story, but it's mainly the way the story is told that I found really engaging and creative. Coming in at number 15, we have Mistral from Beyond, published in 1931. If you're curious, the word Mistral refers to a strong, cold, and dry northwesterly wind that sweeps from southern France into the Mediterranean Sea. The story takes place in Italy under Mussolini's fascist rule, as we follow two American soldiers as they search for a place to sleep and eventually stumble upon some strange local lore. This whole story felt very cold and desolate, as our two protagonists seem out of place in this almost lunar-like landscape. While nothing necessarily is supernatural, I think this story belongs here, as the ghostly atmosphere and grim nature of the secret crime remind me of a horror movie or something. The repetition from the two soldiers of the phrases, "I love Italy" and "I love Mussolini" is a nice sarcastic aside to the gray setting and gives the story some much needed breaks in the tension. The story is also one of, if not the longest story in the collection, being 34 pages long, at least in my edition. The length serves it well though, and the mounting pressure from the surroundings places us right in the shoes of these soldiers as they struggle along to find any sense of comfort in this cold world. The ending page also is some of the most beautiful prose from Faulkner that I've ever read. Coming in at number 14, we have A Justice from the Wilderness, first published in 1931. This story actually begins with a narration from one Quentin Compson, a classic Faulkner character of The Sound of the Fury and Absalom fame. We follow Quentin as he talks to his grandfather, and a story is recounted about the Chickasaw tribe, Chief Doom, and a mixed-race child with an unknown father. The story was really good and serves as almost a precursor to the themes explored in Absalom of what it means to be multiple races and how that affects how the world sees you. The idea of justice and honor, of course, is a main theme, as Doom oversees his parental debate of two men fighting over who will take care of this child. The way Doom interacts with the two fathers is really well done, and it's clear how his version of justice is the one that will decide this fierce disagreement. Like a lot of these stories, that last line is especially a gut punch, and the context of the novels that would follow makes it for an even stronger story. This story, like The Tall Men and Honor, are great examples of Faulkner exploring what justice and duty really entail. Coming in at number 13, we have Carcassonne from Beyond, published in 1931. This is the last story in the entire collection, and is one of the shortest as well. This one is extremely out there and surreal, with most of it containing these strange dream visions of our unnamed protagonist as he desperately wishes to escape his own skin and bones. There's very little concrete anything here, as it's all poetic, stream of consciousness, spurning, longing. It reminds me a bit of Benji's section in The Sound of the Fury, just more beautiful and hopeless than Benji's confused perception of people and time. It's a very unique way to end the collection, and in my opinion, works very well. Like if you worked your way through this tome, then you can earn the right to read some of Faulkner's weirdest writing. Or you could skip ahead, but who would do that? In any case, the imagery of the burning horse galloping across time itself is spectacular and left me pretty emotional as I turned this book's final page. Arguably the most original story here. Coming in at number 12, we have Golden Land, from the Middle Ground, published in 1935. This story follows an older, wealthy West Coast protagonist as he watches the family around him completely crumble. His son hates him, his daughter is in the newspaper for a scandalous lewd act, and his mother desperately wants to escape the Los Angeles home he's placed her in. The story is really depressing, for lack of a better term, as it's clear our protagonist is both the main driving force in this collapse, as well as suffering the consequences of it. He's not a good guy, which isn't helped by his alcoholism, as he seemingly asks for a drink every other page. The story reminded me of the Sutpin dynasty collapse in Absalom, just more contemporary and even clearer condemnation of what the American dream is all about. I especially like the final section, which has us take the mother's perspective as she dreams of their original home in Nebraska, surrounded by wealth, but hoping only for things to be how they used to be. Pretty heartbreaking stuff. Coming in at number 11, we have Red Leaves from the Wilderness, first published in 1930. This is the opening story in the wilderness and sets the scene very well, as this longer story contextualizes what the specific Chickasaw tribe is about, as well as their relationship with slavery. If you've been paying attention, this is also my highest ranked story from this section. This one falls right after the death of their chief, called the Man, as the tribe prepares the burial for him. One custom is the burial of a slave along with the deceased chief, but this slave escapes and then must be hunted down by the new chief in order to complete the ritual. The grim, matter-of-fact tone of the story relays everything, and the fatalistic streak that runs throughout the narrative really reminds me of Light in August, as each character's fate seems already predetermined, with no chance of changing that destiny. This is exemplified with the attitude the tribe takes with hunting out the slave. It's almost casual as they trek through the forest and follow along the signs that he's left, comfortably talking amongst each other like any other day, not like they were hunting another human being to kill him. I also really liked how the story dives into the complicated relationship between the white colonizers and the Native Americans, as white people introduced slavery to the Chickasaw tribe with some pretty terrible consequences. There aren't many white characters necessarily in this story, it's more the influence their culture has that is so divisive. This was a very complete story, and again, cool to see Faulkner write in a pretty different style with a different setting and characters. A great way to introduce this section. And now we're at the top 10. Congrats on making it this far in the video. Coming in at number 10, we have Two Soldiers from the Country, published in 1942. This story follows a young boy and his older brother as America becomes fully involved in World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The older brother Pete quickly commits to the idea of joining the war effort, and as soon as he can, he takes a bus to Memphis to enlist. The unnamed younger brother then, out of a desperate need to be with Pete, runs away and follows his brother to Memphis, navigating his way until he eventually finds Pete at the recruiting office. The story was wonderfully done, and is actually part 1 to another story that I'll discuss later. What this story succeeds at, though, is giving you the perfect amount of information. Every sentence is extremely purposeful and meaningful to the story, and not a word is wasted. There's hints as to the family's history, but everything is kept just out of reach as a young protagonist tries to understand why his brother is going away. I especially like the way the story opened with the two brothers listening to the radio through a neighbor's window, as it perfectly captures why Pete becomes so invested in fighting for America. Hearing only the staticky bits and pieces of filtered information gives him the heroic and idealistic image of war, something to grab onto to escape the desolate emptiness of their home in Frenchman's Bend. It shows how effectively war propaganda converted young men into naive cadets, and then also showed the broken families it leaves behind. Our young narrator's tremendous effort to be with his brother is beautifully tragic, and my heartstrings were thoroughly played with by the time I reached the story's last page. Coming in at number 9, we have Mountain Victory from the Middle Ground, published in 1932. This story takes place post-Civil War as it follows a Confederate soldier and enslaved Jubal as they attempt to return home by crossing through the mountains of Tennessee. Along the way, they come across a home and attempt to stay the night with the inhabitants, but soon discover the family's Union sympathizing tendencies. The story masterfully highlights the tension between the North and the South and how it persisted even after the war was officially over. And tension really is the key word here. This story is extremely anxiety inducing as veiled threats become more and more real, and the evening drags on, and the anger bubbles to the top. Particularly, the family's son Vatch is an extremely compelling character, as the rage within him is barely contained throughout this short story. A terrifying example of a young man's anger, emboldened by war and permitted by the isolation in the mountains. Faulkner does a masterful job of making you uneasy, as every detail kept pushing me closer and closer to the edge of my seat as I read Mountain Victory, all the way up to its violent conclusion. A terrifying story that carries a lot of historical weight in its words, and one that reminded me more of a horror movie than historical fiction. Coming in at number 8, we have Uncle Willie from The Village, published first in 1935. This story follows, from a young boy's perspective, the rambling life of Uncle Willie, a morphine-addicted store owner who defies the moral policing of the town around him. I really enjoyed the happy and loose attitude of the story. The troop of boys that follow Uncle Willie amplifies larger-than-life personality into the stuff of local legend, and the hijinks he gets up to make for a very entertaining read. There's also a layer of tragedy here, too, as it's not like it's all sunshine and rainbows for Uncle Willie as he reckons with substance abuse and the consequences of his own actions. This all culminates in Uncle Willie's reckless desire to fly a plane, a ridiculous stunt that is his biggest act of defiance against this town that has tried to control him. I found the story to be very endearing. You can't help but root for Uncle Willie as he tries to carve out his own little life in this world. The way it's told also serves it very well. It really feels like the kind of thing you would hear from a friend you knew when you were younger, the kind of story that is both legend and truth that makes for a story you can't help but believe in. The story was a great combination of comedy and tragedy and left me feeling a potent mix of emotions as I finished it. Coming in at number 7, we have Ad Astra from The Wasteland, first published in 1931. This is my highest ranked story from The Wasteland, and in my opinion, is the most complete story from this section. We follow a group of pilots as they navigate through a French city, finding a lost German soldier, causing a ruckus at a French bar, and generally trying to survive without losing their wits. I really enjoyed the diverse cast of characters in the group, especially the Indian Subadar, whose dialogue is a high point throughout the entire story. The line, "In my country I was prince, but all men are brothers," specifically stood out to me, really capturing the equalizing effect that war has had on the men here. There's a gleeful nihilism throughout this vignette, like nothing matters at all and that's okay, that gives the story a very freeing, if depressing, mood. The solidarity of the group also stuck out to me. War has really bonded them together in a significant way that goes deeper than blood, deeper than any logical sense. Each member stands out well and has their own unique flair. There's even a member of the Sartorius family here, connecting this distant tale back to the town of Jefferson. The way the German soldier gets incorporated into the group is also great, really hammering home this message that these are just kids fighting in a war, something that Faulkner also engaged with on stories like Two Soldiers. This story is where I would start if you're interested in Faulkner's World War I writings, and is one of the best stories in this collection. Coming at number 6, we have Black Music from Beyond, first published in 1934. This is again the best story from its section, and is one hell of a ride. Our again nameless narrator sits down to eat with a mysterious character by the name of Wilfred Midgleston, a man who the narrator coaxes into telling the story of how he ended up in the current setting of Puerto Rico. What follows is a surreal tale, was essentially a psychotic break that Wilfred experienced in New England, and it's up to the reader to decide how much they want to believe. This story is a perfect blend of reality and unreality, leaning to what you might expect from this section of the book, but never going too far into the craziness. It does a good job of establishing memorable characters, describing some very weird occurrences, and giving you just enough to be begging for more. Like a lot of great Faulkner stories, the fact that it's being told by the person who experienced everything makes it all the more intriguing, as we, like the nameless narrator, have to reckon with how much we can trust this odd man. This story also has some cool inclusions of newspaper articles and letters in the retelling, something that grounds us in reality at least a little bit, and is a fun break from Faulkner's usual writing style. Out of all the stories and beyond, this was definitely the one that left me the most uneasy and off feeling. Wilfred's attitude about the whole story gave some pretty out there vibes. This is the story I'd recommend first if you're interested in the final Beyond section, and it's one of Faulkner's best. And now we're in the top 5. These 5 stories are the ones I consider to be Faulkner at his peak, and are on par with his other greatest works. If you're curious about the cream of the crop of his collection, this is it. Coming in at number 5, we have That Will Be Fine from The Village, first published in 1935. This story places us in Jefferson, following 7-year-old Georgie and his family as they get ready for Christmas. Georgie is thinking about what he's going to do to his grandfather, in particular the money he'll need, which becomes relevant as the story unfolds. We learn soon about Uncle Rodney, a troubled relative who's seemingly involved in something shady, but with Georgie's naive perspective, we don't get all the details. That's part of what makes this story so great, though, its narration. Faulkner writes from the perspective of a child really well, like in Joe Christmas's backstory in Late in August, or Vardaman and Azalea dying, and That Will Be Fine is no exception. Georgie is foolish, starry-eyed, but also motivated by the exact same thing as Uncle Rodney: money. This commonality between them makes for a very intriguing narrative, as Georgie gets wrapped up in Uncle Rodney's latest scheme, a scheme that has dramatic consequences for everyone in the entire family. This is one of those stories that has your stomach drop further and further as you read, dreading what the next page will bring, in the best way. Georgie's naivety about everything going on makes it all the more heartbreaking as it becomes a determining factor in the future of his family, leaving you feeling very powerless as you can only read as it all unravels. This story left me feeling very bad, as do a lot of these higher-ranked stories, in a way that only Faulkner can really inspire. And for that, it lands in the top 5. Coming at number 4, we have A Rose for Emily from The Village, first published in 1930. This is probably the most famous story in the entire collection, and for good reason. It was Faulkner's first short story published in a national magazine, got turned to a PBS adaptation, there's even a few songs written about it. This story is about a woman named Emily growing up in a southern town with a controlling father, who, while she was growing up, denied her from seeing any potential suitors. After her father dies, she becomes more and more reclusive, before falling in love with a man from the north. Time passes and the northern man eventually disappears. Even more time passes and Emily finally dies, with her funeral being the first time the townspeople had seen her in years. In the wake of her death, they investigate her house, finding a locked bedroom with a shocking discovery inside. This is one of Faulkner's most famous works, and I think deservedly so. The story is told with a non-linear structure, and the tiny shreds of information we get place us in the shoes of the townsfolk, aching for more details about what's really going on, and further elevating the mystery surrounding Emily. The division between the North and the South is also a clear through line, with Emily representing the Old South and her northern suitor representing the progressive North, giving us a perfect story of old and widespread beliefs perpetuated through characters that seem as real as you or I. This story has no flaws, is compelling the whole throughout, and saves the best for last. Truly a classic that everyone should read. Coming at number 3, we have Shall Not Perish from The Country, first published in 1943. 1 year after Two Soldiers, Faulkner published a rare second part to the initial short story, something that only happens this time in the entire collection. While other stories are related, this is the only time a clear next step occurs from story to story. And what a second half it is. Shall Not Perish, its title coming from a line from the Gettysburg Address, opens with a predictable beat. The Greer family and our nameless young narrator, now 1 year older, receives the news that older brother Pete has been killed on a ship in the Pacific, along with many other young soldiers. What follows is a deep exploration of grief through several sections, the family physically working away their pain, a conversation with a wealthy Jefferson man who has also lost his son in the war, and a trip to a local museum. These different parts let us see grief through the eyes of many, with the museum section, to me, being the most gripping part. Our narrator has some pretty significant revelations while looking at the paintings hung around the hall, culminating in the final paragraph, which contains some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read from Faulkner. It's bursting with emotion and perfectly caps off this already great story, really boosting what I would consider to be a top 10 story into a top 3 one. When paired with Two Soldiers, this is the strongest 1-2 punch of the whole book, and left me almost tearing up by the time I had finished it. A magnificent work that stands with Faulkner's best. Coming at number 2, we have Barn Burning from The Country, first published in 1939. This is the story chosen to open the entire collection, and it's clear Faulkner wanted to put his best foot forward. This story reminded me a lot of Joe Christmas's backstory from Late in August, which, spoiler alert, is one of my favorite sections from any Faulkner book. The story also is again a young narrator, this time being Sardi of the Snopes family. The main driving force here is the father, Abner Snopes, a vengeful and cruel man whose mean streak has forced the family to relocate several times as he drifts from job to job. This whole story is Faulkner in top form, from the structure to the characterization to the way the plot crescendos into its fiery conclusion. This story, like A Rose for Emily, stands with his best novels and is a great introduction to the Southern master. The story is pained, hopeless, and achingly human as his conflicted family reckons with the rancor that dwells within its patriarch. There's a lot to be said about this story, particularly in the context of class divides, as the frictions between Abner and the wealthier men that employ him is what adds fuel to the fire within Abner, pushing him again and again to acts of impulsivity and violence without regard for the consequences his actions will have on his family and their future. The story fits the short story format well, and with not a word wasted, as Faulkner expertly puts us behind the eyes of this young boy struggling to do what he thinks is right. I highly recommend this story for anyone curious about Faulkner, or Southern Gothic in general, really, and this one has very convincingly earned its place in the top 3. And finally, what you've all been waiting for. Coming at number 1, we have That Evening Sun, from The Village, first published in 1931, and the story that closes the Village section of the book. The title of the story comes from an African-American spiritual, and is another one named by Quentin Compson from The Sound of the Fury. Quentin recounts a story from his youth as, after Dilsey gets sick, a new black woman, Nancy, steps in to be the Compson family's cook and washerwoman. Nancy's past looms over her. Her previous husband, Jesus, left after she became pregnant with a white man's child, but over the course of the story, Nancy becomes increasingly crippled by fear as she agonizes over the thought of Jesus trying to kill her. Her paranoia fills her with delusions of Jesus lurking in the ditch between the Compson home and her own house, leaving her terrified to walk home alone at night to sleep. This story is complicated by the Compson family's indifference to Nancy's worry, as over and over again they ignore and even belittle her for an anxiety over her ex-husband. This story did an amazing job at so many things, whether that be capturing Nancy's tangible fear, the Compson family's lack of care for their black servants, then the horrible dreading feeling that the end of the story leaves you with. Of all the stories within this collection, this was the one that affected me the most emotionally, as Nancy's fear becomes our fear, with the Compson's lack of sympathy just making the whole thing feel even worse, as we too agonize over what is lurking out there in the dark. I don't think I've ever read anything that conveyed what fear feels like as realistically as That Evening Sun did, whether that be its mounting intensity, the irrationality it creates, or just how paralyzing it feels when fear sinks into your bones. While the story maybe isn't the first Faulkner I would show someone, I can't deny that it stood out as the best of the best as I read this huge collection. The story feels like a nightmare you can't wake up from, and for that, it earns my number 1 spot. And that's my list. If you got through this whole video, I'm impressed and very grateful, and even if you skipped ahead, I'm grateful for that too. This book was a ton of fun to read, as was this video to make, and I'm very glad I decided to take it upon myself to tackle this tome. I hope this video inspired you to read some Faulkner, and maybe even check out some of these stories I talked about in this video. Thank you so much for watching.